Hello and welcome to another episode of the Mind Solution podcast. And we're here today to talk about vulnerability and the power of vulnerability, particularly in the context of mental health in the workplace. And despite these being incredibly vulnerable times that we live in, that doesn't automatically give license to us to speak out about how we're feeling and showing our vulnerability to others. It doesn't automatically mean that we're going to start to reach out and ask for help and say that we're struggling. And what I find really interesting to understand is why. What is it about vulnerability that gets in the way of us getting the help that we need, asking for what we need, sharing what's going on for us on the inside? And I'm just going to share with you a particular memory of mine, a particular time in my life, which I would say was probably one of the most vulnerable times that I've ever experienced. And it was 4 years ago, and I'd started having seizures out of the blue, which were actually later diagnosed as epilepsy. And one particular seizure that I had was actually in the middle of the street, where ironically I just finished teaching a workshop on resilience. I know, you couldn't make this stuff up. Now, if you don't know anything about epileptic seizures, I can share with you that they're probably one of the most bizarre experiences, because one minute you're walking along and the next you have literally just lost all consciousness and you've just hit the ground like a sack of potatoes. And what's frustrating is that despite having some extra padding around my bum, I never land on the squashy parts of my body. I always seem to land on my face. So there's me walking along and boom, I'm out. I'm out cold. I'm on the floor. I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing because I'm completely unconscious. And this time I managed to do some quite severe damage. This time I managed to fracture my cheekbone and give myself a black eye that I think would have rivaled Rocky, if I'm honest with you. Now, when I talk about vulnerability and feeling particularly vulnerable at that time in my life, it actually wasn't about the seizure itself that made me feel vulnerable. Because I'm out cold, I come to, there's a man in leathers who I actually do remember clocking was quite cute. So there is a level of consciousness that comes back to you, who was an emergency response guy. But the actual seizure itself wasn't the vulnerable aspect, it was the after effects. So I got taken to hospital, I got patched up, I got sent home. My parents came and took care of me for a couple of days. But about a week later, I needed to go to hospital and get an operation to have the fracture on my cheek repaired. And I remember the days leading up to that and afterwards, I just felt so incredibly vulnerable. I felt really alone. I lived on my own. And although, a lot of friends were being lovely and checking in with me via text every day, it was just so vulnerable. But what was also really interesting to observe is that I also felt ashamed. And I know that might sound a bit crazy, but I felt ashamed to have epilepsy. I felt that because I was a therapist and I spent all my time helping other people, that this shouldn't be happening to me. But it's what I felt. And I was just really witness to that. I was really witness to these emotions of deep shame that were coming up inside of me. And maybe some of that was my inner default, my perfectionist default about needing to be seen to be perfect, and suddenly walking around really not looking perfect hit something deep inside. But what I also find interesting is what Brené Brown discovered in her research that she did about the power of vulnerability, her amazing TED talk on the power of vulnerability. And she describes the relationship that we have with vulnerability and how it's often perceived as a dark emotion, something that we don't want to feel. And how vulnerability is actually often experienced as fear, as shame, grief, disappointment, and uncertainty. And maybe if you were to cast your mind back to a time that you felt vulnerable, perhaps how much that resonates with you. And from my perspective, I was really aware of what I was feeling. I was very conscious. I was very self-aware. I've been a therapist by that point for about 6 years. So I already had a vast level of self-awareness. I'm a huge believer in working on myself. So I was able to just observe what was going on within my mind, within my body, and to be able to sit with those emotions. And I'll be honest, I was still a little bit too battered and bruised to start to process them using some of the modalities that we teach people in the workplace, like EFT tapping. I couldn't start tapping on my face because it was like a balloon, and it was very sore and very tender. But I could just be aware of what I was experiencing, and I could just hold that space for myself. I could be compassionate. I could recognize the shame and not judge it. But not everybody can do that. And for a lot of people, they don't want to experience feeling vulnerable because they internalize that as I'm not safe, I'm uncertain, I'm raw, I'm exposed. So what we do, as Brené Brown describes, is we armor up and we find ways to numb our vulnerability. We find ways to distract ourselves from what we're really feeling. We eat a chocolate chip muffin. In fact, we eat a tray of chocolate chip muffins washed down with a bottle of wine instead of actually expressing what's really going on for us. And what I find really interesting about vulnerability in relation to mental health at work is that despite the focus on wellbeing in the workplace and, well, the enormous focus at the moment on wellbeing in the workplace and campaigns such as It's Time to Talk, what we can't expect is for people to suddenly break with tradition about speaking out about emotions. We can't expect for people to just automatically feel safe to start talking about how they're feeling, because we've operated for so long in this space of repressing how we feel, not feeling that it's safe for us to speak out. And, as technology's evolved and people have started to live through devices more than they have human interaction, it's just continued to close down those avenues to be able to express what's going on for us. So we have to create a culture, we have to cultivate a culture within organisations where people do feel safe to be vulnerable. And one of the ways that I can see managers can do this is by being prepared to be vulnerable themselves. I often hear managers say that behaviour is manager-led. So what is it that managers are doing or are not doing that allows their team to feel safe about speaking out, about being safe to be vulnerable and say that they're struggling, that they need some help? I worked with one manager recently who, after a lot of debate, finally found the courage to share with her own manager how she was feeling. And this lady, she was pretty much on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She was overwhelmed, she was exhausted, she was a finance manager for one of the big banks. She'd really been struggling with her mental health because she'd just been working flat out. She'd had so much pressure put on her to do more that she was at breaking point. And I said, something needs to change here. We need to, You need to be able to talk to your manager about what's going on for you, so that, you're not going to continue, because if you continue, you will have a nervous breakdown. So she did. She dug deep and she found that courage to finally speak to her manager. And her manager's response was, "You should have told me sooner." Is that an empathetic response? No, that's a shaming response. So we need to equip our managers with the ability to have real human conversations that don't result in those kind of responses. Because vulnerability, it also brings with it fear. And in the context of mental health at work, that can be seen as a fear of being judged, a fear of being discriminated against, a fear of being seen to be weak, a fear of being seen to be less than, a fear of what are the consequences if I do speak out? Am I going to lose my opportunity to get promoted? Am I going to be forever held in my manager's mind as the person that couldn't keep their stuff together in this situation? But on the flip side, there's actually also a lot of power that comes from being vulnerable. And I think this is why Brené Brown called her TED Talk The Power of Vulnerability. Because as she describes, vulnerability is the birthplace of joy, of connection, of love and belonging. And I remember myself, after my seizure, going off maybe about a week or so after my operation, to do a talk to a group of scientists about habits and how to form positive habits. And okay, I didn't look like Rocky anymore, but I still had a whopper of a black eye. And no amount of touche éclat was going to cover that up. I tried. Even my mum, bless her, she'd sent me this concealer. And it was like, I don't think that anything's going to cover this up. So I had a choice. I could have done the talk with them all just looking at me, wondering if I just maybe got into a fight on a night out in Glasgow or something. Or I could have chosen to tell my story and actually explain why this speaker about well-being was stood in front of them with this black eye. So I had to do a bit of digging deep myself, and dug deep because I'd not really talked about epilepsy. I'd not really talked about that openly at all. And if I'm honest with you, I was kind of still trying to come to terms with this diagnosis, with this label. And I was also still going through various different scans to find out what was going on at a neurological level. So me standing there in front of a group of scientists literally a week after this had happened was a vulnerable space. And it wasn't about a fear of being rejected. It was actually nothing about that. I think for me it was about, personal pride. It was about professionalism. But then it reminded me that actually this is a lot of what I teach. It's about being authentic, being true to ourselves. So I dug deep. I got my spade and I dug deep and I found some courage. And I chose to tell my story and be vulnerable about what had happened and about what I'd experienced. And what was actually really beautiful about it is that in sharing my story, I experienced a much greater connection to the audience than I could have hoped to achieve if I'd just gone in there and stood talking about habits. I could feel the ripple of empathy in the air, which gave me that courage to do what I was doing. And I think deep down we are all vulnerable. We've just spent so much time running away from vulnerability. We've spent so much time running away from our true feelings and what's really going on for us. So we can teach our managers to spot the signs of mental health in their team. Of course we can. But I think that for the next generation of well-being in the workplace, we also need to teach them how to have real human conversations where they can build true connection, where they can demonstrate real empathy. And through that, we can really start to make some shifts about the way that we interact with one another, shifts that I think are desperately needed. Because it can't be time to talk until we have equipped our managers with that knowledge, with that skill, and also allowed our managers to feel safe themselves about being vulnerable and sharing their vulnerability, being willing to step into the space of vulnerability when their team members sharing something, just in the way that I did with my talk. So there's great power in vulnerability. There's great power to create the kind of human connections that the world desperately needs, both globally and within the workplace. So if you'd like to know more about our management mental health training, then do get in touch. Drop us a line at info@themindsolution or head on over to www.themindsolution.com. And I look forward to catching up with you next week.